John Mearsheimer has published about 6 books, ranging from conventional deterrence to Little Heart, to more recently books on the Israeli lobby, a very popular book that's been translated in 19 or 20 languages by now. And his most recent product, that's going to be the topic of discussion today, Why Leaders Lie. Some of you might say, is that news? Well, let's hear about this topic from John. So John's going to elucidate these things. John, welcome to us.
Thank you very much for the kind words. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll talk for about 40 minutes and I'll be glad to take questions for as long as people would like. Let me tell you how I got interested in the subject of international lying. In the spring of 2003, I got a phone call from Serge Schmemann, who worked for the New York Times. He now works for the International Herald Tribune, although the two are closely linked now. But he said to me, I'm writing a piece for the Week in Review section on lying in international politics. And he said, for some reason, your name popped into my head. I had never met him before or communicated with him. So he said, what do you think? So I thought for a minute and I said, I've never thought about the subject of international lying in my life. And I said, as best I can tell, sort of rummaging through my brain, I don't know of any literature on international lying. So I said, why don't you tell me what you're thinking and I'll just feed off you and then we can go back and forth. So he started and then I responded and we went back and forth and had a very fruitful discussion for about 45 minutes. And after I hung up the phone, I made some cryptic notes on the conversation to myself. And then later that year, I got a call from Josh Cohen at MIT who asked me if I'd come and give a talk. And he said I could speak on any subject that I wanted. So I figured, what the heck, I'll talk about international lying. And I put together a talk and gave it, and found that there was a great deal of interest in the subject, and then gave more talks, and always found that audiences were fascinated. And they were always fascinated with some of my bottom lines. So I wrote a paper and then decided to do a short book, and that's why I ended up here in front of you today. Now, the basic argument that I make in the book is that lying sometimes makes good strategic sense in international politics. It's a useful tool of statecraft. Now, I'm not talking about selfish lies here, where leaders lie for selfish purposes or to protect themselves for nefarious reasons. I'm talking about instances where leaders lie because they think it's in the national interest to lie. To give you a good example that highlights this, that's somewhat controversial, I believe that the Bush administration told 4 lies in the run-up to the Iraq War. But I do not believe that the Bush administration was lying for malicious reasons. I think they felt that it was in the national interest to go to war against Iraq, and they waged a significant deception campaign to get us into that war because they thought it was in the national interest to do that. So it was, to paraphrase Talleyrand, it was worse than a crime, it was a blunder. So I'm not denying that taking us to war against Iraq was a major league blunder. And as many of you know, I was adamantly opposed to the Iraq War. But my point to you is I do not believe that the Bush administration told lies or waged the deception campaign that they did because they were doing it for selfish reasons. In fact, I talk in the book about what I call noble lies. And I'll tell you 2 lies that I think were noble lies. To end the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy had to cut a deal with Nikita Khrushchev. We didn't know it at the time, but the deal was that Khrushchev would take the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, and in return, Kennedy would take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. Now, Kennedy had actually told the Pentagon to get the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey before the Cuban Missile Crisis. but that had not happened. So he didn't feel any compelling strategic reasons to keep the Jupiter missiles there. He was perfectly willing to get rid of them. But Kennedy understood full well that if the American public and the Europeans, especially the Turks, came to realize that he had actually cut a deal with Khrushchev where the Jupiters were exchanged for the Soviet missiles in Cuba, it would cause him lots and lots of trouble. So he told Khrushchev, in effect, that they had a deal, but that Khrushchev could not say they had a deal. And if reporters or anyone in the United States asked him whether there was a deal, he would lie. He would deny it. Now, I believe that was a noble lie. I believe that Kennedy was right to lie because I believe it was imperative to end the Cuban Missile Crisis, given the fact that it was a very dangerous situation. And there's all sorts of plausible scenarios you can spin out as to how it would have led to a general nuclear war had it not been settled. So I think the fact that Kennedy lied about the Cuban Missile Crisis deal was a noble lie. The other example I use is that in 1941, late summer of 1941 in particular, Franklin D. Roosevelt was desperate to get us into World War II against Germany, not against Japan. And he was doing everything he could to get us into the war. And there was a naval incident at sea involving the USS Greer and a British aircraft and a German submarine. This is off the east coast of the United States. And Roosevelt told a handful of lies about the Greer incident that were all designed to make the Germans look like bad guys and us look like innocent victims. And this was all for the purpose of getting us into the war. I actually think that given that the sentiment in the United States in the late 1930s, early 1940s was decidedly isolationist, but it was nevertheless imperative to get into the war against Germany, I think that he did the right thing. It's worth noting in this particular case that he failed. The lie did not work. It was not until Pearl Harbor, a few months later, that we actually got into the war. But again, the basic argument that I'm making here is that lying is sometimes a useful tool of statecraft. Now, what exactly is lying? Cecil LeBach says in her book on lying, which I think is the best book available by far on the general subject of lying. She does not have a lot to say about international lying, but it's actually a superb book, and anybody who's interested in the subject of lying should read her book. And by the way, while I'm on it, Eric Alterman's book, Eric Alterman, who writes for The Nation, has written a book on presidential lying, that it's not a very analytical or social science-y kind of book. He doesn't do what I try to do, but it's a good historical description of lying by American presidents, basically since Roosevelt. He talks about the Greer incident. It's a rather depressing read, but it's also very informative. But I think for anybody who's interested in doing additional reading on this subject, Cecil LeBach and Eric Alterman are both excellent. Anyway, the question is, what is lying? Cecil LeBach says how you define lying says a lot about how much lying you think there is and how useful you think it is. And some people define lying very broadly so that there's therefore lots of evidence of conspicuous lying. I have a rather narrow definition of lying, which I think is a common definition in the literature, and it's certainly the one that Cecil LeBach uses. I believe there are two kinds of lying. One is where you say something that is not true. You simply say something that you know is not true. The other kind of lying is where you make a number of statements, none of which are lies by themselves, but when packaged together are designed to lead the listener to a false conclusion. And let me give you an example of the two lies, the two kinds of lies, by focusing on the Bush administration, the run-up to the war against Iraq. First kind of lie, Donald Rumsfeld said on September 27th of 2002 that we had bulletproof evidence of a link between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. We had bulletproof, quote unquote, evidence of that link. He then said on October 4th, 2004, before the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, quote, "To my knowledge, I have not seen any strong, hard evidence that links the two." Right, that's a lie. Second kind of lie is where you make a number of statements that by themselves cannot be described as a lie according to that first definition, but add up to a false picture. As you know, over half of the American people believed in the run-up to and after the start of the war in Iraq that Saddam Hussein was in part responsible for what happened on September 11th. There is zero evidence that he had anything to do with September 11th. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how is it that over half of the American people believed that he was involved in 9/11? And the answer is that the Bush administration made numerous statements that came close to being lies by themselves, but were not, but led the American people to believe that he was involved in the events of September 11th. And I detail at great length all of those statements in the book. So those are the two kinds of lies. Now I argue that there are two other forms of deception. One is what I call concealment, and the other is what I call spinning. Excuse me. Concealment is where you simply hide information from someone else or from the public. You don't tell a lie. You don't mislead the public by saying certain things that lead them to a false conclusion. You just conceal the information. And a good example of that, which ties back to my first example of a lie, has to do with what Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Zubaydah, two high-level al-Qaeda figures that we had captured and interrogated separately, told the Bush administration about links between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. Both of them independently told the American interrogators that there was no connection at all, and that these two men did not like each other at all. In fact, they disliked each other intensely. The Bush administration, of course, trying to take us to war against Iraq, had a deep-seated interest in concealing that information from the United States public, and they did that, so we didn't know it. So that's concealment, which is different than lying in my lexicon. And then finally, there's spinning. And spinning is where you try to deceive someone, but you don't lie. What you do is you emphasize the positive, you downplay the negative. If Barack Obama were to come in this room and one of you were to ask him, what do you think the future of the American economy looks like? He would spin like crazy. He would emphasize all the positive things that have happened, are happening, are going to happen, and he would downplay, if not conceal, the negative things. Politicians spin all the time. Boys and girls, when they flirt with each other, when boys try to pick up girls or vice versa, they engage in spinning, right? When I do my resume, I don't put in to the resume the fact that I spent 5 years in Sing Sing as a young boy because I tried to knock off a bank and got caught, right? That wouldn't look good. I wouldn't be standing up here if I had told people what had happened to me back in New York in the 1960s. So I leave that out of my vita. I'm not lying, I'm just spinning. And I put all the positive things about my life in that vita or in that resume. That's spinning. To give you another example that really drives this home, think about a courtroom, okay? You have two lawyers, right? Those lawyers, when they make their opening and closing arguments, are not interested in telling the truth. They're not interested in saying anything that might either get their client off or get the other person convicted, right? You follow the basic logic there. It's very different than a person who's asked to testify in a courtroom. As you know, if you testify in a courtroom, you go up and you give an oath that you'll tell the truth and nothing but the truth. You're expected to be a truth teller when you're on the stand. But the lawyers, or if there's a prosecutor and a lawyer, they're not expected to be interested in telling the truth. They're interested in telling a story, in spinning, so that they can get their client off, or if you're a prosecutor, get the person convicted. So I distinguish between truthfulness on one side and deception on the other, and I make the argument that there are three forms of deception: lying, concealment, and spinning. Now, in the book, I distinguish among 5 kinds of international lies. And let me lay out the 5 kinds and give you some examples of each. I also say in the book when you can expect each kind of lying to take place, but I won't cover that here just because of time constraints. The first kind of lie, international lie, which is the most obvious, is what I call an interstate lie. That's where one leader lies to a foreign leader, or to put it in more general terms, lies to a foreign audience. Okay? And let me give you a good example of that. And this involves what I would say is a noble lie. As many of you know, during the Cold War, the United States was committed to threatening to use nuclear weapons, or committed to using nuclear weapons to defend Germany should the Soviets attack and look like they were on the verge of winning. The Germans insisted that we be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend them because they had no nuclear weapons of their own. Now, the Germans, of course, thought we would never have to use those nuclear weapons because they believed that if we had a credible threat to use nuclear weapons in their defense, that the Soviets would never attack. But of course, the Germans suspected that we would not use nuclear weapons to defend them, because it would have been crazy to use nuclear weapons to defend them. If the Soviets overran Europe, that would have been regrettable. But it was certainly far preferable to getting incinerated in the general thermonuclear war. Okay? So, you had a situation where both Henry Kissinger and Robert McNamara said, when they were in power, time after time, that they would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe. In other words, if the Soviets attacked, they said they would use nuclear weapons. They both subsequently admitted that they would not have used nuclear weapons to defend Europe. They were lying. Had I been in their shoes, I would have told the same lie. As an American president or an American policymaker, or as a NATO policymaker, it was imperative that we convince the Soviet Union that we would use nuclear weapons to defend Germany, because that was the best way to make deterrence work. But at the same time, nobody in their right mind would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe, because again, it might have led to, or would have led to, general thermonuclear war. But that was an interstate lie. Hitler lied to us at Munich. Eisenhower lied to the Soviets about the U-2 incident. Some of us in the room are old enough to remember that, when the Soviets shot down the U-2, and they not only got the plane, they got the pilot, Gary Powers. Eisenhower, in one of the low points of his career, told a series of lies about that incident to the Soviets. That's interstate lying. Second kind of lying is what I call fear-mongering. This is where leaders lie to their own publics for the purposes of inflating a particular threat. Sometimes it's just to get the public to spend money to build the forces to contain that threat. We saw a lot of that in the Cold War. Other times, states engage in fear-mongering for the purposes of trying to take a country to war. The 3 best cases of fear-mongering are the Greer incident with Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Gulf of Tonkin crisis War, so-called crisis in August of 1964, which led to some lies by LBJ and Robert McNamara and ended up getting us into the thick of the Vietnam War. And then, of course, the various lies that George W. Bush and company told in the run-up to the Iraq War. So that's fear-mongering. You're lying to your own public for the purposes of mobilizing the public to deal with a particular threat. And that's obviously much different than an interstate lie. Third kind of lying is a strategic cover-up. Leaders engage in cover-ups all the time. Sometimes if you have a policy that's controversial, you don't want to tell your public what the policy is, and you lie about it. This is what Kennedy did with the Jupiter missiles, right? He was covering up what he did. Kennedy made a deal with Khrushchev involving the Jupiters that he felt he couldn't allow the American people and the European publics to know about. He was covering up the policy decision or the deal he had struck with Khrushchev. Another good example of this is if you have a general who's a dunderhead and he's getting lots of your soldiers killed, it's very hard to admit to your public that the general who is in charge of the fighting forces, the general who is in charge of your brothers and husbands is a dunderhead, and that he's responsible for the fact that they're getting killed. So in 1916, Marshal Joffre, who was commanding the French army, was generally seen to be an incompetent general. And the setbacks that the French underwent at Verdun in 1916 were largely seen to be a result of his poor generalship. But the civilian leaders in France could not admit to the French public, especially given the horrific casualties at Verdun, a battle that went from February to December of 1916, they could not admit that Joffre was an incompetent, so they lied about him. Another example has to do with Japan allowing American nuclear weapons to come into Japanese ports on American ships. That's an absolute no-no as far as the Japanese public is concerned, but the Americans, not surprisingly, want to bring ships into Japanese harbors that contain nuclear weapons. So what did the Japanese do? They lied about it to their public. Point to all sorts of examples like that. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about WikiLeaks today. We can do that in the Q&A if you want, but there have been a number of lies that have come out as a result of WikiLeaks that fit in these categories. Then there are nationalist myths, and then there are liberal lies. Those are the last two categories. Let me say a few words about nationalist myths. Look at the Israeli case, the creation of Israel in 1948, and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. The Israelis, not surprisingly, created the story that the Palestinians left of their own volition. In fact, Arab leaders told the Palestinians, according to this nationalist myth, that they should leave. The Palestinians would drive the Jews into the sea. I mean, the Arabs would drive the Jews into the sea, and then the Palestinians could come back to their homes. We now know that that's simply not true. It's a giant lie that's been made up to cover the actual ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. A liberal lie, two good liberal lies. Liberal lies are where countries understand full well, this is especially true of the Anglo-Saxon countries, full well that there's this body of norms, liberal norms out there, many of which are codified in international law, that you don't want to be seen to be violating, because as you know, as good Americans, we always do what's morally correct, and we always obey international law. We never have dirty hands. That's not the way America operates, as you all know. But anyway, of course, that's not true, and we do all sorts of terrible things, and when we do, we tell liberal lies on many occasions to cover it up. One good example is Britain in World War II was desperate in the spring of '42 is they were all fighting against Nazi Germany, and they were in deep trouble. So they launched an air offensive that was designed to kill large numbers of German civilians, mainly German workers. It was a pure counterpopulation bombing strategy, deeply immoral. They were basically going to murder German civilians, much the way we murdered Japanese civilians in the last year of the war. But of course, the British did not want to admit that that's what they were doing, so they concocted a whole story which said that that was not true, that it was military targets that they were going after, not civilian populations. And in fact, they were going after civilian populations. Another good example of a liberal lie is how we dealt with the Wehrmacht after World War II. If you think about World War II, it was the United States and the Soviet Union against Germany. Germany is decisively defeated, and then the United States and the Soviet Union enter the Cold War. And our principal ally in Europe over time turns out to be Germany, because we're talking about fighting a conventional war in Europe. That's the principal Soviet threat to NATO, a war in Europe. And Germany is of immense importance to us. We're talking here about West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. Problem that we faced in the early 1950s when we brought the German army back online is that we had to bring into the German army large numbers of officers and soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front in World War II. And we now know for sure, and we knew then too, that the Wehrmacht had been inextricably bound up in the killing machine on the Eastern Front. But you couldn't bring the Wehrmacht, you couldn't bring all these Wehrmacht soldiers put them in a viable military if they were all a bunch of murderers. So we, along with the Germans, helped create the myth, which again is basically a lie, that the Wehrmacht had clean hands, that it was just the Einsatzgruppe and the various police battalions and other organizations of that sort that did all of the killing on the Eastern Front, and the Wehrmacht had virtually nothing to do with it. And if anything, the Wehrmacht would have shut it down if the Wehrmacht had known what was going on. This is simply a lie. The Wehrmacht was inextricably bound up in the German killing machine, but we could not admit that for the purposes of waging the Cold War, because we needed the Germans. And you understand also, most of the murder done by the Germans was done on the Eastern Front in the war with the Soviet Union. And given that the Cold War was the United States versus the Soviet Union, those generals and civilians who had the most experience dealing with the Soviet Union had been on the Eastern Front. Those were exactly the people that we jumped into bed with. And of course, again, we invented these liberal lies. One final example of this is as we were fighting World War II and the Soviets were beginning to push the Germans back, the Germans discovered the mass graves in the Katyn forest, and it quickly became clear in the West that the Soviets had murdered huge numbers of Polish officers in the spring of 1940. Because you remember, in the spring of 1940, the Soviets and the Germans were allied. They had divided up Poland in 1939, as a matter of fact. And of course, both the Germans and the Soviets had rapacious policies in Poland. And the Soviets took a large number of Polish officers and intellectuals into the Katyn forest and murdered them. And the Germans discovered this. And of course, what the British mainly did was the British, who knew what had happened after the discovery, said that the Soviets were not responsible, the Germans were responsible. Because it was very hard to wage a war against Nazi Germany, which you were portraying as a monstrous state, with the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union appeared to have done such a monstrous thing. So you blamed it on the Germans. even though British policymakers from top to bottom understood full well that it was not the Germans who were responsible for the Katyn forest, it was the Soviets. So those are the 5 kinds of lies. And again, those are strategic lies. Those are lies that leaders tell because they think it's in the American national interest. British policymakers did not lie about the Katyn forest because they were evil people or because they were morally bankrupt. They were fighting a war against Nazi Germany. They thought it was absolutely imperative, which it was, to keep the Soviets in the war on their side. And as a result, they felt they had to make the case that the Soviets were not responsible for the Katyn forest when they were. So this is the basic argument that I'm trying to get out here, that leaders lie because they think that it is in the American or the Soviet or the German national interest. They don't do it for malicious reasons. And this goes back to my earlier point about George Bush. There's no question that George Bush and Dick Cheney and their lieutenants made a huge blunder going into Iraq. But whether or not they lied for malevolent reasons, I think is quite clear. They didn't. They lied because they thought it was in the American national interest. Now let me tell you what the 2 main findings of my study are, which are both quite controversial. My first finding is that there's not much interstate lying at all. I'm not saying there's none, and I've just given you some examples. But there is not a lot of lying. I was actually very surprised. And every time I go around and give this talk, people will say to me when they hear this line of argument that, John, this is simply not true. Lying is rampant in international politics. States lie to each other all the time. That's what diplomats are. They're basically honest men and women who are sent abroad to lie for their country. I'm always shocked at how cynical everybody is. So what I say to these people is I say, look, I have no dog in this fight. Go home, rummage through your brain, figure out what all the lies are, and then send me an email laying out all the lies. And I'll add them to my inventory, because I have an inventory of lies. Anyway, 2 weeks later, I'll get an email from the person who I said this to, and he or she will say, I could only think of 3 lies, and here they are. And in most cases, 2 of the 3 are not lies, and the one that is a lie is one that I had already. Right? People will say this, oh, Saddam Hussein lied. And I'll say, really? Tell me when he lied. And they'll say something, and then I'll knock it down. And there's no evidence Saddam Hussein lied. And I actually start the book off with this whole story that Saddam Hussein was bluffing, he was lying, he was trying to fool us into thinking that he actually had WMD. This is one of the key conclusions in the Dulfer report. It's nonsense. There's no evidence in the Dulfer report to back up that assertion. In fact, Saddam Hussein was telling the truth. Saddam Hussein said, I have no WMD, and he had no WMD. It was the Bush administration that was lying. And this will fit with my second argument, which I'll get to in a second. Or Iran, that's another one, because you know that's our latest bogeyman. Iran. Ahmadinejad, he's a liar. The Iranians lie all the time. I say, well, okay, please point to me, please point out to me where are the examples where Ahmadinejad lied. And nobody can do it, just like nobody can point out to me where Saddam lied. And this is not surprising because there's just not a lot of lying in interstate politics. I found this remarkably surprising for 2 reasons. First of all, I'm a realist, and I went into this thinking international politics is a jaded world. States lie all the time. They have to. Realism 101, right? No. Second reason I was really surprised is you all know that if you're going to buy a car from someone else or you're going to buy a house from someone else here in the land of the free, that you are allowed to lie about your reservation price. That's what the economists call it. In other words, if I want to buy a car from Karen, I say I won't pay more than $1,000, right? And Karen says,
No, you lie. You lie all the time.
you lie all the time, right? You all know the story. I won't go any further. You're allowed to lie about your reservation price. And by the way, some economists say that's really not lying because the other side knows you may be lying. I think it is lying, okay? Now, this led me to think was that when I looked at the negotiations that went into, let's say, creating the European Union or negotiations between countries over tariffs or in arms control agreements, you'd see lying all the time about reservation price. But that's not the case at all. Andy Moravchik, who teaches at Princeton and is one of the world's leading experts on the creation and expansion of the European Union, when Steve Walt, my friend Steve Walt, told Andy what my conclusion was in the book, Andy said, I have to have coffee at the next APSA meetings with John to talk about this, because when I started working on the EU, I thought there would be all sorts of evidence of lying and cheating and so forth and so on, and I couldn't find any. And so Andy and I talked, and I've talked to other people who've worked on the EU. I finally found an example. It's in the book. The Greeks lied about the size of their budget deficit in the late 1990s. And when Sebastian Rosado, who's also worked on the EU and was a former student of mine, finally provided me with that lie, so I had a lie that I could put in the book that fit in that category, I was so relieved. I called up John Newhouse, who's one of the world's leading experts on arms control agreements. And I said, John, I said, you know all about the SALT agreements, the START agreements. Is there any evidence that you know of the Soviets or the Americans or any other player in an arms control agreement lying about their reservation price, saying we won't give up any more than 100 of these kinds of missiles, or we have to have these many missiles, when in fact they had decided otherwise in private? And he couldn't think of any either. So I was very surprised. So then I set out trying to figure out why there's not much lying in international politics. Here we're talking about interstate lying. I want to be very clear on this, because my second argument, which I'm going to make in a second, is there's a lot of lying by leaders to their own people. Okay? So the question is, why is there not a lot of interstate lying? Okay? Two sets of logics. One is that when you're dealing with security issues, what's sometimes called high politics, nobody trusts anybody anyway. And if there's no trust, it's just hard to lie. There has to be trust before you can lie. So what you get is, as you all know, Ronald Reagan's very famous statement, trust but verify. And effectively what Reagan was saying, don't trust, verify, right? So at the strategic level, when you're talking about military or national security concerns, it's very hard to lie because trust is almost completely absent. But what about when you're dealing with economic issues, or what's sometimes called low politics? That's where you would expect all sorts of lying about reservation price, and you don't see it. Now, why is that the case? I think there are two reasons, and they're related. One is the benefits are not that great, right? If you lie or you cheat on an economic deal, it's not like you're going to make that big a killing. But then related to that is the shadow of the future. The fact is that in most cases you'll be dealing with that country that you lied to on numerous occasions over numerous issues over time. And if you're lying, you're going to get caught eventually, and it's going to make it hard to consummate further agreements. So it just doesn't make much sense given the shadow of the future. And I think if you look carefully at the EU negotiations, I think there are all sorts of places where people could have lied and benefited from it, but the benefits would have not have been very great. That's my point. It's not like at the strategic level. Benefits would not have been very great. And furthermore, I think that it would have made it harder to do business in the future. Now, the second thing I discovered is that there is a lot of lying by leaders to their own public. There's a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of threat inflation. And the question is, why is this the case? I believe that this is the case in large part because publics tend to trust their leaders. I tell this story, which is somewhat embarrassing but true. I heard Scott Ritter, who was the weapons inspector, former weapons inspector, who was not only opposed to the Iraq War, but argued in the run-up to the Iraq War that Saddam did not have any WMD. And I heard him give a presentation, and after listening to him talk, I said, he's got to be right. He just sounded right to me. So I decided at that point that they didn't have WMD. Then, however, I heard Donald Rumsfeld say that we know they have WMD because we know where they are. Those were his words. We know where they are. So here's John, right, who went to West Point, who believes in duty, honor, country. The Secretary of Defense says, we know they have nuclear weapons because we know where they are, right? And I said, Rumsfeld wouldn't say that if it wasn't true. And I'm not accusing Ritter of being disingenuous, but he's on the outside, not on the inside. So I decided in my own mind that they had WMD because Rumsfeld told me that, and I stopped believing Ritter. I just thought he was wrong. What's going on there is I trusted my government. This is before I finished the book. Right? I trusted my government. I just thought that Rumsfeld would tell the truth. But that's why leaders can get away with lying to their publics, where it's much more difficult to lie to another state. There's just one heck of a lot more trust, which is not to say there's a lot of trust. And of course, once you get caught, right, it erodes trust in very significant ways. This brings me to the whole subject of the downside of lying, right? The argument I've made so far is that lying sometimes makes good strategic sense. This is my argument. There's not a lot of interstate lying, not a lot, and there's more domestic lying. But my argument is that lying is a useful tool of statecraft. But there is a real downside to lying. And there are two dimensions to this. One is the domestic dimension, which I call the blowback problem. And then there's the international dimension, which is what I call the backfire dimension. And let's take them in reverse order. Backfiring is where if you tell a lie, it backfires on you. It gets you in more trouble than you bargained for. And I'll give you the classic case, in my opinion. Nikita Khrushchev, in the 1950s, decided, after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite in space, and the first ballistic missile. Most of you in this room are too young to remember it, but some of us old geezers remember. The Soviet Union, not the United States of America, was the first country to launch a ballistic missile, and the Soviet Union was the first country to put a satellite in space, Sputnik. What Khrushchev then did is he tried to create the impression that there was a missile gap favoring the Soviet Union. Khrushchev said that the Soviet Union had a large missile arsenal that dwarfed America's arsenal. At this point in time, we didn't have spy satellites up over the Soviet Union, so it was very hard to be sure what was down there on the ground. Remember Gary Powers in the U-2? He gets shot down in 1960, right? It's not till the early 60s that we really get a good look at what the Soviets have. So when Khrushchev tells us there's a missile gap, and we have all this fear-mongering going on in the United States anyway, we think there is a missile gap. Turns out later on there is a missile gap in our favor, not their favor. But Khrushchev tried to create the opposite impression. It backfired on him because the United States jumped on the argument that there was a missile gap and that we were on the short end of the gap, and we put the accelerator to the floor and built lots and lots of missiles. So it backfired. So lies can backfire. The other problem that you run into is blowback. Blowback is where lies by a president or a leader actually poison the domestic political culture. There's no way that any society can function if it's dominated by Bernie Madoffs. You just can't have too many people like that, and when you do find them, they have to go to jail, and you have to send a clear signal that you can't lie, you can't cheat. Otherwise, the country's not going to run very well. I think we all understand this. Spinning's one thing, but actual lying, a country that has a real culture of deceit is going to be in a lot of trouble. And the danger that you run into when leaders lie about foreign policy issues is that it's not too big a step to go from lying about foreign policy issues to lying about domestic issues. Just take the whole subject of fear-mongering, right? Fear-mongering is where American presidents lie to the American people. In Roosevelt's case, it's because he thinks that the American people don't appreciate what a severe threat the Germans are. In LBJ's case, he thinks it's because the American people aren't enthusiastic enough about fighting a war in Vietnam, and he's got to give them a reason to fight there. In George W. Bush's case, it's because he wants to take us to war against Iraq, and he knows that the American people are not enamored with the idea, and he's got to therefore create a picture of a much more serious threat in the minds of the American people, right? Basically what's going on there is that the president, whether it's Roosevelt, Johnson, or Bush, is saying that the American people are not very sophisticated. You can't tell them the truth and take them to war. You have to fearmonger. Well, once you're saying that the American people are not very sophisticated about a foreign policy issue, it's not long before you're thinking the American people are not very sophisticated about other issues as well. And that if you can bamboozle them on foreign policy issues, why can't you bamboozle them on other issues? And once you go down this road, then it's very easy to get a culture of deceit. And if you have a culture of deceit, you know, your country's going to be in really serious trouble. I think we would all agree on that. This is not to say that sometimes people tell lies and you're going to have some amount of deceit in a society, but the name of the game, I believe, is to minimize the amount of deceit that you have, right? So again, the downside of lying takes two forms. Number one is sometimes it backfires, and number two, sometimes it leads to serious blowback. And I would argue, and I argue this at great length, of course, in the book, is that with interstate lying, there's much less chance of backfiring and much less chance of blowback than there is with fear-mongering. My opinion is that fear-mongering is the most dangerous form of lying because it can lead to backfiring. LBJ, George W. Bush, their lies did not work. The end result of their lies were, number one, Vietnam, number two, the Iraq War. They could not sell those wars on rational legal grounds. They had to turn to deception. And it backfired in both cases. And furthermore, there is a real danger of blowback, because once the American people begin to realize that leaders can lie to them, then why can't they lie as well? So I think that fear-mongering is a very dangerous form of lying because of both the blowback and the backfiring problem. Let me just conclude by saying a word or two about the United States. I believe that countries that engage in fear-mongering the most are democracies. Because if you live in a democracy, you're accountable to the people, and you have to basically get the people on board to take them to war. So I think fear-mongering takes place in democracies. I think fear-mongering takes place when states are launching preventive wars. And I think fear-mongering takes place when states are launching preventive wars at great distances. And I think the United States fits very neatly in that set of criteria. The United States is obviously a democracy. It's obviously interested in fighting preventive wars, and it's obviously interested in fighting wars at great distance. Therefore, you should expect to see lots of lying in the American case. And as I point out with regard to the Eric Alterman book, this is exactly what you see. But again, the problem there is there's lots of potential for both blowback and backfiring when fear-mongering takes place. And all of this is to say that as long as the United States has a wildly ambitious foreign policy, you should expect fear-mongering to be part of the warp and woof of daily life in the country. And you should expect that although it may work sometimes, again, my argument is that it does work sometimes, it's necessary sometimes, it often does not work the way it was intended and can cause a whole heck of a lot of trouble. So I'll end on that note, and I'll be more than happy to take folks' questions. Sir.
After listing the different types of lies that you said leaders can propagate, you sort of conclude by saying that leaders don't have a malicious intent necessarily, they just do things that are in their strategic interest.
The country's strategic.
Yeah, sorry, in the country's strategic interest. Following from that, do you think there's a distinction between the Israeli nationalist lie that you talked about that was used to justify ethnic cleansing, which I think is a pretty valuable word, and the British lie that covered up Soviet massacres, which was apparently justified because they were fighting Nazi Germany? Do you think there's a distinction between those two types of lies?
There's a distinction in that they fit in different categories. What the Israelis did, I would categorize as a nationalist lie. All countries have myths about their creation, right? This is not peculiar to the Israelis, right? As you know, the Americans have a whole set of myths, most of which have now been shattered, much like the Israeli myths have been shattered, about how this country was created, where we were the good guys, the Native Americans were the savages, and so forth and so on. You know the story, right? So states are deeply interested in creating myths about their foundings, and the Israelis are no exception in this regard, okay? But that's in that box. What the British did with regard to the Khitan forest, right, was a different kind of lie. That's what I categorized as a liberal lie, right? It was designed to sort of keep them in the war with the Soviet Union. Okay?
Yes, thank you very much for an inspiring lecture. I have a question. I'm still not convinced exactly by your results, in the sense I'm wondering if they are not, if your results are not the result of your typology of lies.
Okay.
In the sense that, for me, let's take the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Indeed, Kennedy lied to his own people, but Khrushchev as well lied to the American people in the sense that he didn't expose the lie of Kennedy, so he did concealment. So I'm wondering if not all the lies of a leader to his domestic public could not be also categorized as interstate lies, in the sense that the leader with whom the deal is made, the foreign leader doesn't reveal the lie, even though he knows that the other leader lies to his own public, he doesn't reveal the lie, so he lies by concealment. So I'm wondering, in a sense, if when you categorize these lies, you shouldn't have like another non-realist approach, in the sense that you have transnational alliances of policymakers who lie to their own public, but also to the publics of the other nations. And I can give you an example with the EU if you're interested, but maybe in an email if you're interested, in the sense like the European lied to the American public about what some European treaties were supposed to do. And some American statesmen knew, but that meaning that didn't reveal what the Europeans were concealing. So,
Well, there's no question, to piggyback your question on the previous question from the gentleman on your left, there's no question that although I put lies in certain boxes, that sometimes a lie, a particular lie, can fit into two boxes. Just think about Kennedy telling the lie about the Jupiters. He was telling that lie to the American people because he was afraid of Barry Goldwater and the Republican right, okay? He was also telling that lie to the Turks. So it was an interstate lie as well as a lie that was a case of strategic cover-up with the American people. So lies can fit in both categories. It is also important to understand, and I think you were getting at this, correct me if I'm wrong, that leaders sometimes agree to lie together to cut a deal of one sort or another. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is an example of that, where Khrushchev and Kennedy are both sort of in on the lie. Although I don't know for a fact that Khrushchev actually lied, that he ever said anything that was not true. But he was definitely in on the lie. But the case from WikiLeaks that is an even better example that gets at this, and it's gotten a lot of prominence, is the Americans approached the president of Yemen about the fact that Al-Qaeda was located in Yemeni territory. And General Petraeus asked the president if the United States could launch missile attacks on Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And the Yemeni president said yes. He said, but we will have to say that it's not the Americans who are doing it, it's the Yemeni Air Force that's launching those missile strikes, okay? And the Americans, of course, have no difficulty with that, right? And what then happens is that there are these sophisticated attacks against Al-Qaeda targets, and all sorts of people get suspicious and start asking, isn't this the Americans at work? The Yemeni president, the last thing he wants is for his people to know that he's in cahoots with Uncle Sam, right? He lies to his people. And then the White House press people, the State Department press people, when asked whether the United States is involved in military operations in Yemen, lies. They just lie, right? And there are a number of other examples of lying in the WikiLeaks documents. But this is a case where two leaders, you know, two sets of leaders, American leaders and Yemeni leaders, are involved in concocting a lie. Yes?
Thank you for a fascinating talk. It seems to me that it's a bold statement to say that leaders or states lie less internationally than domestically, especially considering there may be a lot of lies out there that have never been found out. So maybe states are simply better at lying internationally
Yes.
than they are at lying domestically. Especially like maybe, I mean, this can happen two ways. An international leader a leader that lies internationally may never be found out by the other party, or he or she may be found out, but they may scratch each other's backs because, as you said, internationally people lie all the time. At least that's what the supposition is. So it's really difficult to be convinced that, you know, international lying takes place less than domestic lying.
Yeah. This is a great question, and many people have said to me, the principal problem with your work, John, is that you just haven't dug deeply enough, right? There's lots of lying going on, and it's just that the people who tell those lies are very sophisticated at hiding it. Now, first of all, there's no question that there are huge swaths of history where we just have no records. So it could be in those particular cases that there's just lots of lying, and we can't see it because there are just no records, okay? But on the other hand, we do have historical records, quite extensive historical records, for big swaths of history, especially involving the United States, countries like European countries, a country like Israel. I mean, we just have a lot of evidence there. And the records on various cases involving those countries are remarkably complete, right? And when you look at a particular crisis or a war, I believe that if there was a lie there that played a critical role in making the war happen or affecting the outcome of the war, you'd see evidence of it. It's not like people are covering things up in private all the time, right? And actually you can see quite a few lies. It's not like the lies aren't there. But I don't see you know, that much evidence of lying when you look at a wide swath of history. And you know, I went to, just to take this a step further, I went to about 10 or 15 of my friends who know a lot of history. I have a number of friends, some of whom are historians, who know a lot of diplomatic history. And I asked them, would you please give me a list of all the lies that you can find? And some of those people helped me. Sean Lynn Jones, who's the editor of International Security, and as the editor of International Security reads endless numbers of manuscripts, knows a ton of history. I thanked him. Mark Trachtenberg, a good friend of mine who's a historian, who's actually he's trained as a historian, right? I asked him. I asked Frank Gavin, former student of mine who's a history professor at the University of Texas. I asked all sorts of people. Because when I got into this, I didn't care whether there were a lot of lies or there weren't. I was just interested in sort of trying to figure out what the truth is. And none of them could come up with examples. And it's just hard to believe, given all the records that are out there. The other thing is, I don't think people are that embarrassed about lying. You know, because I don't think they're doing it because they're malevolent and they're going to make a lot of money for themselves. They're doing this because they think it's in the American national interest. Kennedy didn't bat an eyelash when it came to telling a lie. Right? When you're running the national, when you live in a state that has a large national security establishment, you're involved in the Cold War, telling a lie is not a big deal. And it's not going to be something that you're terribly ashamed of. Maybe lying to people, your own public, right? So you may be right, and heck knows, I'm really kind of the first person to sort of systematically look at international lying, and some of my arguments may be wrong, and my evidence may be wrong.
I certainly didn't mean to suggest that you haven't dug deep enough. I was just suggesting that if the lie isn't found out by anyone, there will be no record of it, period. So it's really hard to empirically verify that less international lying happens than domestic lying.
But the lie, if it's told, should affect the course of events. And you should see the course of events go this way or that way, and you should be able to deduce that there's a lie there. You may be right. I mean, believe me, I've thought about your question.
Okay,
Sir.
So I'd like to recognize that you know, the observation that sometimes lies are done for good effect. Sometimes there are noble lies, right? I mean, if there's a lie that the U.S. will retaliate with nuclear weapons to defend Germany, there should be a lie that prevents them in thermonuclear war, right? But another thing you say immediately after that, I think is a little bit problematic, right? Because you say that leaders lie in the national interest, they don't lie for malicious or malevolent reasons.
In these cases,
In these cases, well,
there are some examples where they do lie for malicious reasons.
Right, well, I mean, it just seems that depends very much on what you think the national interest is and whether, it seems to give a lot of moral weight to the national interest, right? Because I think that, and perhaps George W. Bush thinks that invading Iraq and preemptive war to take a supposed security threat or a potential security threat is in the national interest, but and a lot of other people might not agree with that, right? Depending on what the conception of the national interest is, right? But I mean, I think that if you look at any leaders, they're going to be taking, there's some people who could be pulled into non-national interests, but Stalin concealed cotton forests, and he probably thought that was in the Soviet national interest, and Hitler said that he was attacked by Poland, and I don't doubt the sincerity that he thought Lebensraum was also the national interest of Germany.
If somebody's the head of a particular company that does business in Latin America, and they help push the United States into war to benefit that particular business, right? It's for the selfish interests, or of steel makers, or some big industry is going to benefit from a war, and it's just the industry that's benefiting, not the country at large, then I would say that that's a selfish lie. I think there's no question that people can disagree about what is in the national interest. And just to go to the example that you raised, Iraq, right? I believe it was not in the American national interest, not in the American national interest to fight a war in Iraq. But Bush did believe genuinely that it was in our national interest. Again, it was a huge blunder on his part. I'm not defending him on those grounds. I just think that the deception campaign that he and his lieutenants waged to get us into that war was done for what they mistakenly thought were good strategic reasons. Just to come at this from a slightly different angle, a lot of people see many of Dick Cheney's moves as evidence that he was lining the pockets of Halliburton and that he expected to go back into the private sector and make huge amounts of money, right? And many people argue that the Iraq war was really all about oil, and all of these oil barons were going to make huge amounts of money, and the Dick Cheneys of the world were going to profit, and so forth and so on. If that were true, that would be a selfish lie, okay? But I don't think that's what happened. I mean, we could debate that, but my personal view is I don't think that's what happened. I think it was mainly the WMD issue, right? It was this perceived threat from Iraq, misperceived threat in my opinion, but this threat from Iraq that drove them to go to war against Iraq. But it can be tricky in some cases to separate what is a selfish lie from a strategic lie.
Yeah, and I wouldn't deny that there can be other reasons for going to war, right? People hold all sorts of special interests. But I'm just questioning whether saying that one goes to war for the national interest or one lies for the national interest puts a moral patina over the national interest or attaches a kind of moral weight to the national interest that perhaps may not deserve.
I just want to be very clear. I said at the beginning of the book, there's a whole moral dimension to this issue, which I'm completely ignoring.
Sure.
Right? I'm not saying it's not important, but morality's just off the table. This is purely a function of strategic calculation.
Yeah. John, you're a little fairer to George W. Bush than I would have expected.
Everybody says that.
And you can talk a little bit about Blair and the British people's attitude to Blair, Tony Blair, taking them to war in Iraq, and believing that they were deliberately lied to. I mean, it just seems to me there's an element there of that is not just, well, they blundered, they were in the national interest. There's an element there of why did these leaders do this? What was the motivation there? And I seem to feel that certainly there was something there in terms of Bush and Cheney, that was not just thinking of the national interest. But I certainly think, I know about the British and their feeling about Blair, is that there is some dimension of some crookery, some funny business that took place there that was not in the national interest as to why this happened. I'm not so sure about that.
Okay, well, first of all, on Blair, I do not have evidence that Blair lied. I have not investigated the case carefully, okay? And going back to my discussion of what a lie is, as I said in the very beginning, it's, I think, important to have a rather narrow definition of what lying is. Not an unreasonably narrow definition. I like the Cicely-Bach definition, which is the definition that most people use. And you could find all sorts of incidents where people spin or conceal but don't lie. In other words, they're involved in a deception campaign, but they're not lying. And I do not know that Tony Blair lied, okay? Now, I think there's no question that the British people, or the British public by and large, was out of sync with Tony Blair on the whole question of the Iraq War, much more so than the American public was out of sync with George W. Bush and company. And I am sometimes amazed that Tony Blair was foolish enough to go to war with George Bush in Iraq. You would think that he would have known better. Anybody from Britain who knew the history of the British Empire would have recognized that invading and occupying Iraq is a prescription for big trouble. You would have thought that. But I think that Tony Blair was a fool. Right? I don't think that he was a crook in the sense that he was doing something that was designed to line his pockets or his friends' pockets. I just think he had this view that the United States and the British working together could perform all sorts of miracles in the Middle East and that we would all live happily ever after. I find it hard to believe that they could have thought that, which then may lead you to the next step, which is to think that maybe they were crooks. But I have no evidence of that. And I also just have no evidence that Blair lied.
A lot of fascinating questions here. First of all, about your supposition that there isn't very much lying. One of the areas I work on is voter identification, and there's very little indication that there's in-person voter fraud that, for instance, an ID card would affect. In the Indiana case, there was never an exam, yet people can't believe that. So often things that could be empirically shown, although you can't always prove that there isn't evidence you don't know about.
I'm not clear on that. Just
there is a supposition that there's a lot of in-person voter fraud. People go and vote for other people. There was a Supreme Court case.
Okay.
I was in the media center.
Okay.
The Indiana government, even though they were a party to this case, could not prove any cases of in-person voter fraud in anybody's memory or any proven cases. And yet many, many people feel that there's a lot of voter fraud and that you need an ID. So I'm just saying this is similar to your claim. How do you deal with the question that the Bush administration, their intelligence indicated that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and practically everyone except the inspectors who you mentioned, and I heard Scott Ritter speak about this also. But the Bush administration actually believed that there were weapons of mass destruction that were a problem, even though Saddam told them they didn't and provided all this evidence. So if they actually believed it and all the evidence pointed in that direction, is that really a lie? Or is that just being more incredulous than they should have been?
Well, again, I was very careful. When you accuse somebody of telling a lie, you want to be very careful of what you're defining as a lie. And you remember when I talked about Donald Rumsfeld and the link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam, he said that we had bulletproof evidence before the war, and then after the war, he said he had never seen any evidence.
But that's a different question from the question of weapons of mass destruction.
No, I'm coming to. I'm coming. But my point is, you want to be very careful is to define exactly what you mean by a lie. And just on the WMD issue, we had no hard evidence that they had WMD. I think it was reasonable to assume that they had WMD. You could assume they had WMD, but we had no hard evidence. And there is all sorts of evidence now that people in the inside did not have hard evidence, right? I tell the story about how Tommy Franks, when the whole subject of invading Iraq was first broached, told Rumsfeld and others that they had been looking for Iraqi WMD for a long period of time and had been unable to find any evidence of it. So we had no hard evidence, right? Where Rumsfeld lied is when he said, we know they have WMD because we know where they are. That's the lie. We didn't know where they were. We just didn't. Otherwise, we would have told the weapons inspectors and they would have gone and found them. We didn't know where they were. And of course, we didn't know where they were because they didn't have any, right? But to say we have to go to war because we believe they have WMD is not a lie. That's not a lie. It was nothing wrong with believing they had WMD. And you can tell all sorts of stories why it was reasonable to think that they might have WMD. But it's when you say, we know they had WMD because we know where they are, we've seen them, then you're lying.
And also, didn't Blair have a white paper telling him that there were no weapons of mass destruction? This is really a different situation. He was being told that. And also, the British public was fairly supportive of intervention right before the intervention. Only the U.S. public was majority support, but British was close to that situation.
Well, I'd have to go back and look at all of that really carefully. I'm not terribly comfortable talking about the British case because I don't know it like the back of my hand. The American case I know very well. By the way, the other case where I do believe there's evidence of lying is the 1999 war against Serbia over Kosovo. I believe if you look carefully there, you can find evidence. I mean, I've not done it, but I believe you could find evidence if you look carefully of lying in that case. Ma'am?
Well, there are some amusing gotchas in the wiki links, leaks, information. How do you, as an academy man, feel about WikiLeaks?
Well, I have mixed emotions about WikiLeaks. I'm not talking about the lying part, just the whole subject of how I think about WikiLeaks. I think it's quite clear that it would be very difficult for the United States or any government to conduct foreign policy in smart ways if you lived in a world of constant leaks on the scale of WikiLeaks, right? So on one level, it's not good. But on the other hand, when you look at American behavior over the past 10 years, and you look at how much trouble we're in and how foolishly we have behaved and how much deception there has been, I think it's a very good thing that we have WikiLeaks. I think WikiLeaks serves an important public service. It is my same attitude towards the Pentagon Papers. It's very important for the Pentagon Papers to come out and lay out in great detail just what had happened in the run-up to the Vietnam War and in the conduct of the Vietnam War in the early years.
Didn't change behavior, though. Do you think WikiLeaks is going to change behavior?
It's hard to say, very hard to measure those sorts of things. I think that American foreign policy was a lot saner after the Vietnam War. And I believe it will be a lot saner after we finally end the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. That may not be in my lifetime, but when we finally get out of those places, 20 more years to live. Right. But I think that, revealing all of the documents about the run-up to and the conduct of the Vietnam War was ultimately very important. And doing it at that particular time was very important. just important to get the facts out. I mean, leaders or governments go to great lengths to hide information from the public for obvious reasons. They don't want us to know when they screwed things up and when they deceived us and so forth and so on. And again, some of that's understandable. The point that I tried to make to you is that lying sometimes makes good strategic sense. And so I don't want to be in a situation where I say we should have WikiLeaks type data dumps all the time. But I think given where the United States of America today, it's a healthy thing. Yes?
Looking at what you were saying about sort of lower politics and trade and how there's not a lot of lying in state negotiations and trade, the examples you gave are all in systems that have a very strong economic hegemon to hold the systems together. Do you think the facts of whether countries will lie more or less when making trade deals or tariffs or whatnot changes depending on the polarity of the system and the strength of the hegemon?
Well, but just to go to the European community, which then becomes the European Union, with Andy Moravchik, Sebastian Rosado, and these people all focused on, which you know all about, there was no hegemon involved in creating the European Union, right? It was bargaining. I mean, this is Andy's story. It was bargaining among the states of Europe. I mean, some states like Britain and France and Germany were more powerful than others. But it was a bargaining process. It wasn't like there was a hegemon or a night watchman who was monitoring the process in any meaningful way. No, my logic should apply to non-hegemonic structures, to put it in social science speak. Because the basic argument I made is that the benefits of lying are small and the costs are huge because of the shadow of the future problem. That's why I thought you just didn't see much evidence of people trying to sort of bamboozle the other side in trade deals or what have you, when economics or the environment or what we sometimes call low politics were involved. But I don't think it's because of the presence or absence of a hegemon. Yes, Mary.
I got a couple questions about your two scenarios, the interstate one and the domestic one. So I assume in saying that there's not a whole lot of lying going on at the interstate level, you don't want to say, or maybe you do, that it's all about truth-telling. And that's what's going on at the interstate level. And likewise, at the domestic level with fear-mongering, why isn't it the case that truth-telling can sometimes be as linked to fear-mongering as lying? So we know Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was in some respects linked directly to 9/11. There was a whole lot of fear-mongering going on around 9/11 on the basis of certain kinds of factual truths also being told, not just lies. So those two pushes against your scenarios suggest to me that the lying, truth-telling frame might not in the end be the best way to think about politics in the way that you're thinking about it. And you know you're Machiavelli. Politics, the prince can't be successful if he's a pure liar or a pure truth teller. Rather, it's all about working in half-truth.
Yeah.
And if you think in terms of working in half-truth, then you get a whole lot more complicated issues about rhetoric, about deception, about insinuations, about manipulations, that lying, truth-telling frame doesn't really get to or complicate very issues.
Yeah. I'm with you. Let me just deal with your first point, which you sort of came back to at the end, and then I forgot your second point, but let's go to that one as well. But just on the first point, first of all, when I went out and read the literature on lying, what I discovered, which was quite uncomfortable, but I came to accept, was the argument in the literature, which is commonplace, that we're all engaged in deception all the time, right?
In politics, I don't know about
even in our daily lives, right? In terms of dealing with colleagues in a department, right? You couldn't tell your colleagues what you really think most of the time. Boy-girl relations, parents dealing with their children, right? But what I then discovered is that what people were really saying was not that people are lying to each other all the time, but they're involved, my phrase is spinning. There's lots of spinning and lots of concealment, right? And so our daily lives, right? And then when you go to talking about interstate politics. There's a tremendous amount of deception going on. So it's not like John is, and I was obviously not clear enough on this. It's not that John is saying there's not much lying, therefore there's truth-telling, right? And that's what I led you to believe. Yeah. That's not the argument I want to make at all. And even if you go down to the individual level, so to speak, family, you start thinking about how a family operates, right? I engage in deception all the time. It was very disconcerting for me to sort of accept this, right? My wife asked me, what do you think of my dress, right? I always tell her, you look beautiful, right? I deceive my kids all the time, not because I'm malevolent, but I'm trying to get them psyched up to do the right thing and not do the wrong thing, right? ... You know the story, right? So I believe there's a great deal of deception. To take it one step further, I think the most formidable form of deception in terms of interstate politics is concealment, right? And states go to great lengths to conceal certain things from other states all the time. And then, of course, there's spinning. Just look at the Chinese president and the American president in Washington talking to each other and talking to the world. I mean, to use my father's old term, baloney benders, right? These guys are just spinning like crazy. They're not truth tellers, but they're not liars. I don't think anybody's told a lie. You see the argument. So Mary cleared up my argument in a very important way. I'm not arguing it's truthfulness versus lying. What was your other question?
Well, one was about the use of truth for fear-mongering. So fear-mongering isn't simply connected.
Oh, yeah. Fear-mongering. Yeah, well, the point, I tried to make the argument that if you're dealing with Adolf Hitler, right, you don't have to do much fear-mongering past a certain point. After March 1939, when he takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, it's pretty clear what you're dealing with, right? So you can paint the threat in really stark terms by just telling the truth. That's not fear-mongering. Fear-mongering is how you deal with this guy after he remilitarizes the Rhineland in 1936. Then in 1937, he doesn't do anything particularly aggressive, right? So it's early 1938. We haven't had the Anschluss yet. We haven't had the Munich crisis. All he's done is remilitarize the Rhineland, which belongs to Germany anyway. You think that he's the second coming of Attila the Hun. How do you convey that message to people? You have to fearmonger. You have to invent stories about him, right? And of course, this is what we do with Saddam and what we do with Ahmadinejad. We describe them as the second coming of Adolf Hitler because there are just not enough facts in either case to make the argument that they are that dangerous. You can argue they're adversaries, that there's a potential danger there, but, so we threat monger, right? That's threat mongering. And I separate that from a fact-based portrayal of a hostile or dangerous person. Tom.
I'm curious about this line between spinning and lying. And earlier you said, in a slightly different context, that Ahmadinejad and Saddam, there was no proof that they actually lied. And I'm just wondering, in the context of denying sort of human rights abuses within their own country, which I think there's plenty of evidence that both did that. Ahmadinejad with the Green Revolution last year in terms of saying students who behaved aggressively, or in another sort of context, third world leaders taking money from the World Bank and pocketing it and then saying it was sort of reasonably spent. And in terms of what they do inside their own countries, they lie all the time to international institutions and to Western countries because they want to conceal. But at what point is that concealment basically telling a deliberate mistruth?
Well, leaders who steal money and put it in their bank accounts are not doing something for the national interest. That's not, pardon?
But they're lying.
Oh yeah, no, again, I remember up front I distinguish between selfish lies and strategic lies. Okay, so there's a very important difference there. And I'm not denying that, the president of Tunisia wasn't lining his pockets and his wife wasn't lining her pockets and they weren't lying. I mean, but that was not for the national interest, okay? So you want to keep that distinction clear. Now, with regard to Saddam, excuse me, and Ahmadinejad, and the whole subject of lying about human rights violations, I don't know the case. If you could go back and show me where they clearly lied, I'd be willing to accept it. But when you say those sorts of things to me, I'm kind of skeptical. Not because I'm skeptical of you, because on the contrary, I have great respect for you, but I'm kind of skeptical because I've heard other people say before to me that, you know, here's evidence of where Saddam lied, here's evidence of where Ahmadinejad lied. And when you look carefully, they didn't lie. And again, I'm not defending them as nice guys, right? The question is, did they lie or not? And if you have a particular definition of lying, anyway, yes?
We'll take one more. We're almost out, well, we are out of time, but maybe we'll just take the last one.
Thank you. It seems to me, I'm wondering if there's a frequency in which your categories lie in terms of regime type. Because it would seem as though fear-mongering and strategic cover-ups may be more frequent in democracies because there's more of a need to convince one's public.
Yes, that's my argument.
Okay. And so then, are you suggesting that these are strategic tools in actuality to overcome the thresholds that underlie the theory of potentially democratic peace? Because lying is a way of circumventing those barriers in some ways?
No. I didn't see it as having anything to do with democratic peace, because why would you want to... The democratic peace argument is that democracies don't fight other democracies. And I don't see evidence that people are lying because they want to go to war with another democracy.
Right, but even the strain of it that says that a democracy in general may be less likely to wage war because they have to convince their public, right? And so therefore they're less likely to go. And in the examples that you gave, it seems that the leaders had to convince a more skeptical public. And so that's when these strategies...
My argument is they're more likely to lie because they have to convince their public. Do you see? Yes. That's the point. I'll take your question in a second. Just let me do one more. No, I just want to make sure I'm answering your question. My point is that if you live in a democracy, right, you can have an imperial president, but even imperial presidents care about public opinion. By the way, the truth is that even in autocracies, right, even in autocracies, leaders care about public opinion. There's a whole literature on Hitler and public opinion in Germany. Ian Kershaw, who's written this superb 2-volume biography of Hitler, his early work was on public opinion in Germany. And Joseph Goebbels, the notorious minister of propaganda, was constantly monitoring what the German public thought, because Hitler understood full well that he had to take into account in his decision-making what the German people would and would not do. So even in non-democracies, you see evidence of that. But apropos your starting point, you see much more of it in democracies. I'll take your question.
Very clear example, Ahmadinejad is famous for saying there are no homosexuals in Iran. And
right.
they have to wonder why he would waste his credibility on a point like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That either
right,
he's
there's a high cost to ruining your credibility, and what benefit does it get from saying there are no homosexuals in Iran?
Yeah, either he's delusional or he's lying.
Right.
And if I admit that he's delusional, that cuts against my argument that we don't even have. I don't think he's pursuing nuclear weapons, but if he were, I often argue that he couldn't do much with them because they have very little offensive utility. But if he's so delusional he believes there are no homosexuals in Iran, maybe we can't trust him with nuclear weapons. That's a very good point.
We're out of time, and that's the truth.